Hello everyone and welcome to The Deep Dive, a new show. This is episode 1 on this channel that on a weekly basis will be diving into the most interesting meta topics of our industry. We've also had a major announcement today, so be sure to hit up the link down below for more on that. And with that, let's get into the video. The discussion surrounding the difficulty of games has been fascinating, both as a topic and the sort of situation with it all online. And there are valid points on all sides, but I think something is not being talked about. Something that presents a bit of a threat to the quality of games as art. You see, we all regard the music, the visuals, the writing, and the performances of games as art. But there are times where I do feel that mechanics are not treated in the same way. When presented with niche music that is challenging to appreciate and technical, most of us would just think, that's not for me. Or maybe the same goes for more dark, disturbing works of art, say like Geiger. Well, you know, if we don't like it, we just kind of assume it's not for us, and if we do, then we do. Well, just like those things, game mechanics are art. Game mechanics are designed to create a deep, emotional experience within the player, whether it be the catharsis of mechanics backing up a storyline in a really tense moment, or the feeling of flow from playing a bullet hell. To what degree mechanical difficulty plays a role in that art varies on a per-game basis, all based on what the developer wishes to create. This is not about arguing for one extremely hard difficulty mode for all games. This is about arguing for the developer's vision of their game, be that the rock-hard Sekiro or something that is more accessible and customizable. And to be clear, this is not a video about accessibility accommodations. I think they're an incredible thing to see, and this video is absolutely not against them, and I will talk about them later. Now, this entire thing was kicked off by Sekiro, the latest game from Software, the creators of Dark Souls and Bloodborne. Sekiro follows a similar game format, but it couldn't be more different. Like Dark Souls, it is a very fair game where there is always a clear causal link between your actions and the results, especially when you die. The difference is the difficulty in executing those actions. The Souls series is more slow-paced of an experience by default. Souls gives you the opportunity to play a more difficult parry-based build if you so wish, but also the option to roll around with a shield. This diversity of builds in Souls basically is difficulty selection. It's something that FromSoft knowingly included as a part of that experience. Then, by being primarily roll-based instead of being parry-based, and by having rather generous timings, it ends up being a remarkably accessible game to players of a broad range of skills. Sekiro, however, is a far more focused game. In Sekiro, you are a shinobi, you fight like a shinobi, and that is its experience. That is what FromSoftware wanted to deliver. The entire combat system is about speed. It prioritizes parrying, and that is something that is significantly harder to pull off consistently than the rolls of the Dark Souls series. Dark Souls had its varying difficulty by design. Its enemies are puzzles, and its builds provide different rule sets by which you approach those puzzles. Rule sets with varying difficulty levels, and that's the design of the game. If Dark Souls had implemented difficulty through, say, damage and health sliders, then the core of those puzzles would have been eaten away at. If a fight doesn't last as long, then the attrition and resource management aspects of its design will not factor in as much, which would be to the detriment of the game's intended design, i.e. to the art the developer wanted to create. Sekiro is a more focused game. It's a more niche game. It does not appeal to the whole of the core Souls fanbase. Why? Well, because that just happens to be the developer's vision for that game. They wanted to make a game where you played as a shinobi. They designed every single mechanic around that. The feeling of vulnerability, the fast-paced combat, all of those things are core to the intent of their art, to the core of what they want to evoke in the player. And that's why I really respected Jim Sterling's video title when I saw it. I didn't like Sekiro, and that's okay. Just like how Dark Souls would be compromised by its difficulty being delivered through sliders, not build diversity, Sekiro's design would be compromised by difficulty settings which would run counter to its design pillars. Yes, I do think that speed sliders run counter to the core of the game. Sekiro simply is a game with a smaller audience than Souls, and that's okay. Indeed, I think it's a brave decision. In making it, FromSoftware placed their artistic vision first at the expense of sales. The ability of a developer to do that is extremely important to the future of games as art. For years, we have seen people rail against games compromising their core for more sales. This doesn't just apply to difficulty though, it applies to everything. Developers being able to create challenging stories, to create games that don't fit the mold. Indeed, while I don't particularly enjoy games referred to as walking simulators, I defend their right to exist for the exact same reason that I defend the right of Sekiro to have its one uncompromising difficulty mode. That is the artistic freedom that keeps our field vibrant and diverse, full of games that in aggregate appeal to a broad audience. Rather than make all games accessible to everyone, we should champion a larger field of more varied games such that more people will have games that appeal to them more directly, instead of games that are, well, somewhat homogenized. Somewhat appealing to everyone, but not really being that special to anyone at the same time. These decisions should firmly, though, be in the hands of the artists. Whether decisions work or not, well, that's down to the value that the market places on the product. So when should they make those decisions? What's the cutoff point? I think Mass Effect 3 is a wonderful example here. It contained a difficulty mode that essentially was story only, trivializing combat. And that begs the question, is combat core to the art of Mass Effect 3? That's for the developer to decide. Now, from my opinion, I would say the Mass Effect 3 is a fantastic example of when you should have such a difficulty setting. The core of that game is the fantasy of being Shepard. It's about leading people, managing relationships, and the plot. And while the combat of Mass Effect 3 certainly could be fun, especially in PC, it wasn't really the thing that would set it apart. Indeed, if the mechanics of Mass Effect primarily act as a delivery mechanism for its plot, and in the eye of the creators are not really the point of the game itself, then that's a prime example of when you maybe could implement a more robust difficulty customization mode. Look, they could have put auto-aim into that game and I would not have minded as a consumer, because I don't really think it would be compromising the game's core vision. Now, Naughty Dog's Uncharted 4 is another fantastic example of that, and I think a perfect way for us to hone in on the distinction that this video is sort of trying to make. What is the core fantasy of being Nathan Drake? Well, it's really that of being the modern-day swashbuckling adventurer, something which of course ties wonderfully into the more dark and critical narrative of Uncharted 4. And it shipped with auto-aim. Now, while I wouldn't use it in PC, I did use it on console, along with playing on the hard difficulty. I viewed the core of that combat system as being the positional gameplay, with the accuracy of the stick shooting not really meshing that well with the speed of gameplay that could be there, especially with their highly positional, rope swinging gameplay. So its inclusion sort of did enhance my enjoyment of the game, and that leaves us in a funny position with this. Here's the thing, that determination is Naughty Dog's to make. It's about what they want to deliver as art. They clearly decided that pinpoint console stick aiming was not a requirement for their game's ability to mechanically deliver its fantasy. I happen to agree with them on that one. Equally, if that game was less Indiana Jones and more John Wick, then perhaps the auto-aim wouldn't be a good thing. But then, even with that, auto-aim could be worked into a super fast-paced gun-fu fantasy that would work for a John Wick-style fantasy. That would be an example of a potentially challenging yet accommodating game that works like that through design. Ultimately, the point here is that it rests with the developer to tease all of this out. It's about their art. Naughty Dog felt that auto-aim was not detrimental to Uncharted 4. Yet, if you look at, say, the rather strange gun handling of The Last of Us, you see a game with difficult, rather obtuse shooting that was implemented to evoke a particular gameplay fantasy. Then, for both games, like with Mass Effect 3, they really were story more than mechanics, so I think one can see why Naughty Dog would feel okay with implementing easier modes so that the narrative experience could be opened up to more people, if they felt that the narrative experience really was the core of the art they were trying to make. Indeed, difficulty can almost be applied to narrative as much as it can be to the execution of mechanics. And this is something that comes up with The Last of Us again, given its midpoint scene between Ellie and David. A less challenging version of that scene that avoided its very uncomfortable subject matter would have been more accessible. But I would argue it would have been to the detriment of the game. So my position on the difficulty of all aspects of games is essentially that I wouldn't tell Banksy to paint a different mural. Perhaps I don't like what he makes, that's okay, but I'm not entitled to ownership of his creative process. Finally, there are two extra topics I want to mention. So, accessibility. When possible, I think it is wonderful that developers implement accessibility features in their games, especially with Microsoft's accessibility-focused Xbox controller. That is something that I think is heartwarming to see. It's something that I will always champion, be it as simple as colorblind settings, or be it something more, like a developer implementing accommodations for a mouth-based controller. I think that stuff is truly wonderful to see be embraced by our industry. Of course, there are some games that, will and won't work for stuff like that, depending on their designs. That's okay, but fundamentally, I love that that stuff is being worked on. And then finally, correctly implementing difficulty is actually expensive. It takes up a lot of development time. That increases the cost of making games. And this is yet another reason why I think developers should have complete creative freedom here, because often it makes a lot of sense for a dev to pick one difficulty and do it right based on their game and how it's balanced, rather than having to commit to a great experience on many different difficulties, because doing that right might run counter to the budget of the game. Also, some game mechanics just fundamentally work within certain balance thresholds, I would say especially for the Dark Souls series, and that is a case where a difficulty that's too hard or too easy might actually run detriment to the design. So there you go, that is my thoughts on the difficulty discussion. I've tried to go with a different angle here. I think that there is a bit of room for a development first angle, especially one that I think equally will defend a game that's extremely easy and a game that's extremely hard. And really for me the point is, yeah, Dear Esther and Sekiro, I defend what they are, both being niche games that don't appeal to everyone. I defend what they are for the same reason, and I think that ultimately is the pathway to us having more, I'd say a larger number of more niche games. And I think if that is the case, then really people just end up with games that are better targeted towards what they love. And I think that's great for the creative vibrancy of our industry. Of course, feel free to disagree. Please let me know what you think down in the comments. And then, of course, there's the large announcement that we had really with Phase 1, the new Phase 1 of this channel starting off now, and our big plans for the future. So thank you very much for watching this video. Let me know what you think, and I'll see you next time.